As we continue our look at the book of Daniel, more and more we're going to find out that there is just so much in here that speaks to us today that we really need to be aware of, that it really helps us begin to understand just how much God is in control of things as well. But it's just one of those books that we, like I said last week, we so often gloss over so much of what's there, and we have a tendency to miss what's really going on and what it is that Daniel is trying to get across to us in his book. And so last week we laid the groundwork for our study in the book of Daniel, and we said that the book of Daniel sets out to answer two questions that the Jews would have had at that time. And those questions we also asked today, and that is, if you would, is there God truly God as compared with the Babylonian God? And, if you would, will God forgive the sin of His people and resume fellowship with Him? And those would have been the two major questions that the Jews would have had as they went into exile. So that is the heart and theme of Daniel, to answer those two questions for them and for us. That being is, if you would, is our God truly God? And will He forgive us and redeem us? So, we also began to see that Daniel really is a book about the clash between kings, kingdoms, and gods. And the more we begin to understand what is taking place, rather than taking the usual simplistic, moralistic approach to the Bible stories that are there, the more the message that Daniel has for us today begins to unfold. So, let's pick up by revisiting a short section of the passage we started with last week and take a deeper look at what's happening. If you would, Daniel 1, picking up at verse 6. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach. And to Azariah, Abednego. Now, as we talked about last week, there's significance to the fact that these guys are all from Judah, and there's also significance as to what's taking place here with the name change. You see, we're seeing the battle against God continue to unfold when they are given new names that reflect the idolatry of the Babylonians. For instance, Daniel means, if you would, my judge is God. Belteshazzar, the Babylonian name he was given, means basically, if you would, the protector of the king. Then Hananiah. The name Hananiah means, if you would, Yahweh has shown grace. Shadrach, or Shadrach, means, Aku is gracious. Aku was the Babylonian moon god. So begin to see that typically what it took place was people's names meant something. To the Jews, their names were reflecting the name of God Almighty. To the Babylonians, the names are reflecting their gods. And so Aku was the Babylonian moon god. Mishael means, if you would, who is what God is. And it's very similar to Micah, like the prophet Micah, which means who is like God. Meshach, or Mesha-Aku, means, if you would, who is what Aku is. And then you have Azariah, which means Yahweh has helped. But then the name he was given, Abednego, or Abednego, means, if you would, servant of the god Nebo. So you see this shift in the names taking place. All of their Jewish names reflect who their God is and the relationship between God and His people. The new names they are given reflect who Babylon's gods are. And so we have that shift taking place. And what is interesting is that as we go through the book of Daniel, even when he has been forgotten about, Daniel is still called, if you would, Daniel throughout the book. When the writing appears on the wall and God judges Belshazzar, the queen doesn't say she remembers this 80-year-old guy named Belteshazzar. She says, hey, I remember a guy named Daniel. So she tells him, no, he was able to help out Nebuchadnezzar. Maybe he can help out in this situation too. I mean, he interpreted dreams and he was able to do all this stuff, and so they called Daniel. And as we see what's taking place, it seems very fitting that Daniel would be the one who chronicles these events of the book. Even his name reflects what is taking place throughout the book, and that is, if you would, God is judging. The Jews are in exile because God has judged them. Throughout the book, God judges their captors. You see, if you would, God is the supreme and absolute judge over all the universe. And so how fitting is it that the author of the book is Daniel, whose name means, if you would, my judge is God. And the entire book of Daniel is about God pronouncing judgment. So what is the significance of changing their names? There's more to it than just changing their names. You know, a lot of people look at it and say, well, they changed their names because now they're in Babylon and so on. But we need to begin to understand what is taking place so we understand how significant this is and what is going on. You see, what's taking place is, if you would, they are trying to strip them of their Jewish identity. They're trying to strip them of their Jewish identity. So the first thing they do is they change their names. How effective have they been at that? Well, sadly, if you mention Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, most Christians today have no idea who you were talking about. We have to use the names Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. Even today, we still allow their God-given identities to be robbed from them by not calling them by their Jewish names. And so as we look at what's going on, we begin to understand that the change of names is also an indication that there is a clash of cultures going on. So let's back up again, back to Daniel chapter 1, a few verses before where we just read, in verse 3, where we read, Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So look at that. Think about what that says. This is not a random selection. The king is very specific. And these are not little boys. Okay? They are, if you would, young men. They're from the royal family and the nobility. And because they are of the royal family and the nobility, they would have received the best education in the land. Understand, Jewish children all received a good education. But royal families and nobility, they got the best. They're not just educated in the basics, but also educated to take their positions in the government and the communities. Significant. Why would you want people of the royal family and nobility? Well, we'll consider that in a little bit. I'll let you think about it for a few minutes. You see, if you would, the chief of the court officials was to evaluate all of them and select the best that Judah had to offer. They're going to change their names. They're going to change their learning. They were to be re-educated for 3 years. They're going to change their diet. What does he want them for? If you can change the royal family and the nobility, you lower the threat of rebellion in the land, because the people will follow the royal family and the nobility. George Schwab wrote, if you would, the youths were expected to eat new foods, were given new names, and forced to learn the culture of Babylon. They were being systematically indoctrinated and distanced from their Israelite heritage. At the end of the process, they would no longer be Jews, but Babylonians. They would have new identities. That was the goal of everything that's going on here. That it is, if you would, to turn them into good, loyal Babylonian citizens. To destroy their identities. To change them. To make them loyal to Babylon. To make them loyal to their captors. And how do you do that? If you would, through government-run education. There's an irony here. People will run to this passage in order to justify sending Christian children to government schools, and the text actually teaches us that if you want to destroy someone's identity, you have to re-educate them. Is some of this sounding a bit familiar? A bit like what's happening in our collapsing culture today? Now, there's some myths about Daniel and his companions. In many circles, there is this false belief that they were boys who were going to be educated according to the Babylonian education system instead of the Jewish. Daniel's companions are often referred to as the 3 Hebrew boys, his companions, and they're looked at as being like 8, 9, 10 years old. Okay? And the next myth is that Daniel and his friends gained their knowledge and understanding from the Babylonians. That they were so brilliant because they learned the Babylonian stuff better than any other people. And they did better in their Babylonian education. The next myth is that Daniel and his friends represent the ideal, that we should be willing to send our children to the Babylonians of our day so that they can gain knowledge and status within the context of the Babylonian culture around us. Well, here's the reality check, if you would. Daniel and his friends were young men and would have been between 15 and 20 years old and already well educated. Matter of fact, if you would, they have already completed their Jewish education within the covenant community in Judah. Listen to the requirements again. Daniel 1:3. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. See the qualifications? He's wanting young men who are already educated, who've already completed their learning. And if you would, they were to have a certain family background so that they would be useful to him, like we already talked about. And if you would, they had to be good looking. And if you would, they had to show aptitude for every kind of learning. And how would you know they had that aptitude? Well, they've already completed their Hebrew education. They are already very well educated, and they demonstrated that fact when Ashpenaz interviewed them and talked to them. Not only were they well educated in the covenant community of Judah, if you would, they were the best and brightest at the end of that education. They're the ones that graduated at the top of the class. And if you would, they were well informed and quick to understand. They had a firm grasp and understanding of the world around them. They were exceptional young men. And they also exhibited the poise and demeanor and personal presence that made them capable to stand before the king. And this was long before they were set apart and ever learned their first Babylonian word. You see, the message is not that we run to the Babylonians of today to gain their knowledge so that we can be elevated in their culture. It's quite the opposite. You see, if you would, when we understand who God is the one who makes us knowledgeable and skillful and wise. And if you would, it is the knowledge and wisdom that He gives that we should be seeking above all other knowledge and understanding. Not the knowledge of the culture of the world around us. But yet that seems to be the focus in so many families today, even in Christian families, that we're so concerned that our children get this education from the Babylon of today that we shirk our responsibility to give them the education of the understanding of God. James tells us, if you would, if any of you lacks wisdom, you should ask God, who generously gives to all without finding fault, and it will be given to you. And we read in Proverbs, if you would, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. We also read in Proverbs chapter 2, my son, if you accept my words and store up my commands within you, turning your ear to wisdom and applying your heart to understanding. Indeed, if you call out for insight and cry aloud for understanding, and if you look for it as for silver and search for it as for hidden treasure, then you will understand the fear of the Lord and find the knowledge of God. For the Lord gives wisdom. From His mouth come knowledge and understanding. We find ourselves in a society today where we've got Christian parents sending their children to Babylon to find wisdom and knowledge rather than steering them to God. It's no wonder we see the situation we find ourselves in today. Because you see, true wisdom isn't just gaining information. We need to understand, if you would, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And one of the things that I think has become very evident in our nation today is that there is very little fear of the Lord. I mean, think about it. Most people assume everybody's going to heaven. I mean, nobody ever considers the possibility that so-and-so who's passed away may not be going to heaven. I mean, it's one of the things that I see online so much over and over again. Celebrities who have died that at no point in time ever lived a life trying to serve God in any possible way. Instead, lived detestable lives. And yet people believe they've gone to heaven, even though their life was spent in opposition to God. And so as we're looking at Daniel in these opening passages, what we're beginning to see is that even though they are in exile, if you would, we see that their culture is superior because it is ordered by the true and living God. And we're going to see that come to light again and again throughout Daniel, that because God has ordered the culture of the Jews, that He is the one that is at the head of things, their culture is superior. And we will see that unfold over and over again as these cultures clash. You'll especially see it more next week as the events of this first chapter of Daniel continue to unfold. And as we look around at the circumstances we find in the culture of our nation today, let's be honest. If you would, we have become exiles living in Babylon. There was a time when this nation was seeking to please God. There was a time when education in this nation was put into place for the primary purpose of teaching children to read the Bible so that they could seek God. And then Babylon took command of the education system. and began to re-educate. And in light of what we've been looking at in the Scriptures, maybe we need to make some major changes and stop letting Babylon re-educate our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. For some of us, it may be too late for that realization when it comes to our children. We didn't notice what Babylon was subtly doing until it was too late. But we can still step up and try to do something about it with our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. When Babylon took over, it all began when prayer was taken out of our schools and things began to go downhill quickly. Babylon was beginning the process of re-educating our children. Do you realize that stripping children raised in Christian homes of their God-given identity is exactly what separation of church and state is all about? The idea that church should have no influence in the public stage or in government? That's what it's about. And they are doing today exactly what Babylon did when they took Judah into exile. How are they doing it? They're no longer teaching logical thinking, for one. They are teaching conditioned thinking. And they address conditioned thinking up and call it critical thinking, so it sounds like it's good. Oh, we're teaching critical thinking. I mean, after all, doesn't that sound like it encourages questioning? But in actuality, they are teaching conditioned thinking. So what am I saying? Well, logical thinking questions and does not accept what experts such as teachers, professors, or whoever have to say on blind faith. Instead, all claims are open to debate and open to being questioned, regardless of what it is. Even if you would, even our faith is not a blind faith. The Bible is given to us, and its writers are basically saying, look at the evidence we provide and decide. Matter of fact, John wrote in his epistle in chapter 20, if you would, Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. In other words, what is John saying? If you would, this is what I saw, and I wrote it down so that you may believe by logically considering my eyewitness account. In other words, this is what we saw. This is what we experienced. You make a logical decision based on the evidence. It's not a blind faith. But our children are being conditioned to question nothing that they are being taught in their primary education, so that when they leave home for their secondary education, if you would, anything they are told by their professors and instructors is considered to be the gospel truth, and anyone who disagrees is stupid and grossly uninformed and doesn't know what they're talking about. And I can guarantee you there are parents today that are running up against that wall, trying to get their children to see the facts and get nowhere. Well, my teacher said this, my professor said this, and they're the experts. And they think because they've been to college today, they know more than everybody else. They have a better understanding of life than those who've been here twice as long as they have. They are taught to evaluate truth based on feelings and not facts, and that is at the heart of critical thinking. As a matter of fact, if you would, it is at the heart of the woke movement as well. Mom and Dad are especially looked at as undereducated and stupid when we try to get them to see the truth as opposed to the lies of Babylon. We just don't know what we're talking about. Why? If you would, because they think with their feelings instead of logically with their heads. Babylon has re-educated them. Facts mean nothing to them. And as a result, if you would, Babylon is succeeding in stripping our children of their identity and their faith by using the same process that ancient Babylon used of re-education. Like I said, if you would, we've become exiles living in Babylon. Let me ask you something. If you would, have you become a bit too comfortable living in Babylon? I mean, really think about that. Are you okay with the way things are going? Are you okay with what our children are being taught in the schools? I mean, maybe you knew something wasn't right, but couldn't put your finger on what the source of the problem is. And I mean, perhaps you didn't even realize what's been happening. I think that's happened to a lot of Christian parents. We knew something wasn't quite right. We just couldn't put our finger on it. Let me ask you another question, and I want you to really think about this question this week and be honest with yourself, because this is a scary question. If you would, has Babylon managed to subtly re-educate you? If you've already jumped to an answer to that question without taking a lot of time to think about it, there's a very high probability you've been re-educated. Think about it this week. Has Babylon managed to re-educate you without you realizing what was going on? You know, it's really amazing how much Daniel speaks to our world today. Oh, that's stuff in the past. We can learn the moralistic view, but when we begin to really dig into it, we begin to find out that there's a lot that's life application for us. Daniel, in many ways, is a book written for us today to help us to understand what's going on and help us to begin to understand what we need to do as God's people. Next week we're going to see these clashes begin to play out even more as Daniel speaks to us through the events that are going to be occurring. In many ways, as we look at the book of Daniel, we find that the people of Judah were sent into exile to be punished because of how far they had drifted from God. But as we're beginning to get into Daniel, what we're beginning to see unfold is that Daniel and his companions were led there for another reason. And we're going to let that begin to speak to us as we continue to dig deeper into the book of Daniel throughout this study. Let me ask you another question. Where is God leading you? Is he trying to lead you someplace and maybe you're in that stubborn mode and no, God, I just don't want to go that route? I think we all have times like that. We all have a tendency to get stubborn with God. I think one of the evidences we see of Daniel and his companions, even just from our surface view of the Bible stories, is that they were willing to go where God led them. Are you prepared to go where he leads you? Do you need to say, yes, Lord, I'll follow?